Welcome to another Nordic APIs livecast. My name is Bill Doerrfeld, and in this event, we'll be exploring building intentional APIs. So doing things intentionally can mean many different things, but for our purposes today, it boils down to having a purpose-built API. And I think this is really important right now because many organizations are at that point where they're trying to scale their API practices and treat them more as legitimate products rather than just engineering offshoots. I think having more intent and more API first thinking could help downstream processes like documentation coverage, tech to business alignment, helping things be more consistent and have a better developer experience. And arguably, which I think is going to be a big topic of conversation today, is positioning AI for API consumption. So if we're doing that with more intent up front, I think we're going to have better outcomes with that and better business results too. So to help explore all these areas, we've brought in a great cast of speakers today. We have Emmanuel Paraskakis, CEO and API product strategy consultant at Level 250. We also have John Bogard, Chief Revenue Officer at digitalML, and Karl Fankhauser, a seasoned healthcare IT architect, founder of Advanced Healthcare Automation, and former Director of Enterprise Architecture at Kaiser Permanente. So I'll be helping to moderate the discussion. Thank you for everyone who's joining and listening, and to our awesome speakers today. We're going to have questions come in real time with the Q&A. If you are inclined to, ask a question, please do so, and we'll try to take it later on in the event. And we'll be posting this recording to YouTube shortly after the event too. So yeah, let's get started. I would just love to, set the stage here. What do you think it means to build an intentional API? Carl, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll kick it off, and I think if you've touched on a lot of it, but I think if you back up a step from the API itself and look at the underlying resource, I mean, you've invested money into automating, storing data, building processes around some enterprise resource, correct? And so it's already important. And it should be something that you know what you want to do with that resource. And so I start with that. I mean, the intent of the API now is to expose that resource to others, right? So that's the first thing. And then I think what you want to look at is where do you intend to expose that? Is it internal, external, both, right? What are the business objectives that you want to achieve with that that resource? And the API is going to help you achieve those objectives. So I think that having those objectives in mind is a critical thing in designing the API. And then, once you've automated it, you're not doing it for one time, right? You're doing it for over and over again. And so your API, guess what? It's not being done for a one-time use. So I think you want to start looking at all of those drivers and look at it as what's the organizational intent, not just some project goal. That's too small. I mean, these APIs need to be strategically valuable, not just simple project enablers. So I think those are some of the intents that you want to look for in designing the API.
John, does that resonate
Like
with
that.
you? You see these business objectives really driving API design?
I like that framework. They're deliberately designed with the business and technical context and realities of what they're exposing, and then designing them deliberately so that they're discoverable, so that they're reusable, so that they're aligned to those business objectives and technical realities. And then, I think at the enterprise level, if you zoom out, that means not just the endpoint, but the full context of the API and the documentation that is associated with it. So think things like ownership and life cycle and governance and how it fits into the broader service and business capability model. At the consumer level, that that means structured, discoverable, semantically rich APIs that act either as a self-service onboarding process for developers, for consuming developers, or as an automated way for LLMs and AI agents.
Right. So it seems like there's a lot more to it than you might think if you're not like super familiar with API management best practices. It sounds like Emmanuel, anything to add there on what intent?
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, first of all, I've been an API product manager for more than 15 years. And for us product managers, it's always been the struggle to say, we are going to build with an intent and we're going to build APIs as products and not byproducts of some engineering process. So that's always been a challenge, if you will. And the idea is that you have to build your products and your APIs with intent, because as any organization will tell you, we have limited resources. So if you try to build something that is without an intent for the market, without a benefit for the market, without having done the discovery and the research, you're going to waste resources. You're going to put a product in the market that maybe, who knows, the market might not want. And at the end of the day, you're not going to achieve your strategic purposes. You said it. So the aim of product strategy is to make the most of your limited resources that you have to drive your organizational goals. And I think intent for products, and especially for APIs, is super important here.
Let's go a little bit deeper into something you mentioned about downsides of not taking a product approach to API design, and what are the risks of, allowing API design just to happen organically, but without any guidance or governance?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing as if you were to build a UI-based product, where you might say, well, I have a good idea about what the market wants because I've been part of the market for a long time, and I know what's best for my users. It could work. A lot of times it doesn't work. So what you have to do is do that product discovery, create your wireframes for your UI-based products, and go and test things out, ask people what they think, get their feedback, and then build a product that truly resonates in the market. And I think it's the same thing for APIs.
Interesting. Either John or Karl, have you witnessed this kind of product thinking really benefiting API designs in practice, like within your work?
Well, in terms of the downside, I guess I've seen kind of the anti-pattern, if you will,
Yeah.
where and I think the downside, the big downside of unintentional design to me is cost, right? And Manuel, you touched on it, right? And kind of going the other way, but if you start down this path of and like I think the anti-pattern, if you will, that I've seen is where every project gets their own API for the same resource, for the same thing, right? Bill gets one, John gets one, Emmanuel gets one. They're all basically the same, but now they're point to point. So now we've just tripled the cost to develop the same thing 3 times with minor variances. And now the development team is all sucked into supporting 3 times as many APIs than are really needed, right? So I think it's those costs that that really are very, very concerning about not going after a real intentional API that multiple people can use, because you want to keep the development cost to the lowest. The other downside from a different perspective that really probably concerns a lot of people is security, right? Every API, right? It's a gateway into your organization, but hey, it's also a vector for attack.
Yep.
So if I've just created 5 APIs that do the same thing and exposed them all, now I've got 5 vectors for attack when I could only have 1, right, that I need to defend and monitor. So I think those are some of the really big things in my mind from kind of not focusing your efforts on that minimal, powerful set of API versus sort of a sporadic, sprawling collection.
I mean, that makes so much sense. We have all this duplication. It just leads to the potential for shadow APIs to, not be discovered and be lurking out there, and so much, yeah. Beyond
And there's one
cost,
more downside, that you're confusing the markets, right? You're
Yes.
confusing your consumers. Like, okay, which one of the 5 am I supposed to use? And now they have to like spend all this time and then maybe get back to you and say, oh, which one do I use? And then everybody's confused, and you have to just spend more time.
confusion,
side of that,
cost, any other downsides, John, you'd put in?
the other side of that coin, Carl and I talk about this all the time, that fragmentation, the duplication, the security risk, the cost, but also that reputation hit. You put out an API or a bunch of APIs and it doesn't work like you think it's going to work. Well, it's a pain for the API consumers. The API consumers start telling their friends and their colleagues. There's an inside secret about these APIs, not only not working from a reputation, but also from I was relying on that. I was relying on that for my core application or for my system. And I think one, there's a reputation hit internally or externally, but now we're introducing this to AI agents. We're going to see just you skip your turn. Now you've missed that opportunity with the AI agent consumption. They can't figure it out. It doesn't work like it's supposed to. You got to go back and rework your distribution model. I think that other side of the coin of a reputation hit goes hand in hand with the cost, with the duplication, with the security, with the fragmentation that you all have mentioned.
And an extreme version of this that I witnessed was talking to a trading partner, and who basically flat out said, yeah, we just don't sell your product because you don't have the right APIs.
Huh.
I mean, they were selling the other guys, but not us,
Wow.
right? And, if your APIs are A, missing, or B, this fragmented mishmash of some things are good, some are bad. If you get the good one, you don't, you're happy. You get the bad one, you're not, and you go into this agent world, then you're just going to get left behind, right? It's you really have to be very, very careful that you are very competitive in the market of your API products.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, developer experience matters so much. And if you're providing a really inconsistent experience with different naming conventions, different standards throughout a portfolio, I could see how it would turn off potential partners in an instant if you're just not meeting the basic standards out there. We were originally gonna, title this webinar reusability, or having it be a theme about reusability, but we kind of took a step back from that because, top-down API mandates for reusability, they don't always play out that well. And, maybe reusability isn't like the core benefit from a great intentional API design. Yeah, where do you guys think that they fall short in actual implementation? These kind of top-down, Bezos mandates, let's externalize everything from day one. Like, is this the real benefit we're going for here? Carl, do you want to pick this one up?
I think so. I think there's a value in this, in having some sort of strategic directive, right? And maybe it doesn't need to be quite so much as a mandate. It clearly worked for Amazon, right? But I think interestingly, I think the friction you most commonly see, or I've seen, is not developers so much as project managers who think, oh, I've got some money, I just want my thing, give it to me, I don't care. And then there's a notion that if John and Emmanuel both have to use the same API, and John has a new requirement, that he's going to have to wait for Emmanuel somehow, or vice versa, right? So I think that's kind of a friction area that that I've seen a lot, sort of the big argument against it. And then you get developers who just, oh, I just want to develop, I don't want to wait. It's like, to me, that seems sort of a job security approach, which I think is a little weird. But the biggest stuff I've seen is just where it's like, I don't want to get into the bandwagon. I just want to have my own thing, right? And the downside, like we mentioned, is, well, you driving up the cost, and you may or may not end up with that gold standard API, right?
Right.
If no customer pays for that. And there's approaches for like having that reusable API, and then you can, have a BFF, if you will, to so that your application only consumes the piece of that you want. I mean, that's really, I think, the right approach, so that the resource provider is only interested in that enterprise gold standard API. So I think that's some of the areas with the friction. Yeah.
Look, sometimes top down also works. There's situations where it's appropriate when you have to move very fast, produce many APIs for a quick win. Maybe it's a project that has to happen very quickly. Sometimes it's an appropriate way to do it. Of course, if you want to go long term, you have to think about an approach that works and matches the approach of the organization. And as you said, some people will kind of bristle at oh, well, you're not letting me innovate here. But when you talk about governance, I think the right thing to do is to start saying, well, look, how about we take all the boring things out of the way for you, like all the bike shedding. Let's have the discussion once. Let's figure it out and then collectively follow some of the standards that we are going to set. So you got this collective approach, but also once you've had the discussion, you then proceed with the standard and not discuss it again. And I think that matches very well when we matches the use case very well when we start to build with AI and call it vibe coding, code it code gen, whatever, because these code gen assistants and copilots, they're almost like a entry-level intern that you have to give them all the instructions. So if you have all of your standards and all of your conventions set up very early on, and you can feed them to CodeGen, they will follow those. And you have to have those figured out because they will invent their own otherwise, as I've
I
seen.
think this doubles down the importance of having great, strong, well-defined API specifications too. I was chatting with another senior engineer recently, and he was talking about how his team is vibe coding against API specifications for parallel development, which I thought was pretty cool, because instead of like giving the agent an entire data set, you just give it a schema that makes sense for what everyone's developing toward. So yeah, I definitely see like good, strong API design helping in this new like AI assisted coding environment. But you kind of mentioned governance, right? And in the greater software development world at large, there's this whole trend around platform engineering, right? Having paved roads for developers, having golden paths. And it seems like in the API community, governance is our equivalent to that, right? So how do we get a great governance down? Is it, what does that consist of? Is it like consolidating API management platforms, having some sort of security guidelines set for everyone to follow? Like, what does this look like in practice? Emmanuel, do you want to answer that, and then maybe we could hop over to the others?
Very quickly, and maybe I'll give some, give the floor over to others. I would say, as my friend Kevin Swiber says, people, process, and technology. So figure out who's going to do what, who's responsible for what. Do I have the right people on board? And then process. Build the process around the people. And then finally, the technology that actually implements the process. And I'm sure others will have to say much about those, but that's the framework I think to start with.
Sure. Yeah, and John, Karl, any ideas, especially on having governance that hopefully reduces that friction between architects and developers?
Karl, you've got a very unique perch in this and perspective in this space. One, from the realities of being in the enterprise, there are some top-down mandates that are needed, and things like governance, security, frameworks, policies. These aren't nice to haves. They are top-down mandates that enable, that secure the enterprise, but also enable the developers. And then I think as you break out governance, not all APIs have to be built the same. Not all APIs are governed and reusable the same. A business capability API that's going to expose functionality to a partner is going to be governed in a different way than a point-to-point service that gets blown away when the application retires. And so there's a very good fit for the top-down mandate and all things governance. But I really like it when we meet developers and users where they are. And so by baking in some of these governance and standards and patterns into the life cycle of the API, making them easy to consume, you're now enabling the developers to follow those governance patterns. And by baking it in and meeting the developers or the users where they are, it's not a nice to have, it's an enabler. It's automating those manual tasks. It's removing the ask for, let's ask a developer to look at a PDF or SharePoint file to align to the governance. And it's baked into the process. And I think that's been the most effective when we work with enterprise customers. And Karl, you've got a unique perch coming from Kaiser Permanente.
Yeah. So, one thing is like, I think looking at it as a mandate is from a top down is some, hopefully you can avoid that. And it's getting alignment around a strategic direction, right? So I think that's one aspect. People need to understand that they're not just integration toys that IT uses. This is a business strategic enabler. And I think that's kind of a critical thing. And once you start with that, you start focusing on the API as a strategic enabler, not just some project integrator, right? So I think you've got that. And then as you start looking into the governance areas, I really strongly feel that you want your governance, and Emmanuel, you touched on it, talking about like essentially product owners, the people who owns the API space, right? And they should be the expert on that API, right? So let's say Emmanuel is the owner of API X, right? But he hasn't implemented it yet. And I come along and I'm like, oh, I really need that API. And Emmanuel's like, I don't have bandwidth to do it now, but I'm like, I can do it. Does the organization care who implements it? Not really. It doesn't exist. We've got some standards, maybe some guidelines, branding, the governance, security guidelines, all of that. So as long as I implement to those standards, guidelines, brand, etc., and Emmanuel looks at it and he says, yeah, we can take this in as the product. It fits the bill for at least version 1. Who cares who builds it? But it's one of those things that we can roll that out. Now, once it's been created, Bill comes along and says, oh, I'm going to build one. It's in our catalog and it says, hey, we don't need another one. Bill may need something added to it. Now we run into the who's going to maintain it, upgrade it, etc. Maybe Bill adds to it. That's fine too. But essentially you have the product owner who I think is providing the governance of what that API delivers, right? And then in your pipelines, validations that it meets your brand, it meets your security, etc. And that stuff should all be just automated through your pipelines. And I think through some of those things, you change the governance to really more of product validation, if you will, and pipeline validation testing than sort of this onerous governance thing that, oh, you can't do this. No, that no one wants to hear that, right? So
yeah, I think everything non-functional should be set and kind of not set in stone, but pre-exist. And that way, yes, you can kind of swap teams and say, okay, team B can build the API now because team A, who knows, they're involved in something else. So as long as the non-functional requirements are figured out, then team B can go ahead and build. The only caveat there, I would say, is that team B also needs to have some of the domain expertise and the product expertise to be able to deliver, as well as team A, who was originally
Yes.
the people that came up with the idea or that validated it in the market, and so on. So that has to be there. And again, that's a product function,
Yes.
of sorts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, hearing a lot of interesting ideas. I'd like to pivot to that famous two-letter acronym right now, AI. We've heard a lot of interest in this, in case you hadn't known. It's really impacting the API economy lately on a new scale in the last year that we didn't really anticipate. There's a lot of interest in how do we make these APIs ingested by these AI agents that are coming onto the market. I would first like to, get a sense of the rise of this and how it's affecting APIs at large. Would anyone like to chime in to kind of paint the picture here?
Again, kind of to set the framework here, I see it touching on APIs in three ways. So first of all, and kind of the simplest way, if you will, is that we are all going to use AI to build APIs, whether it's to generate our open API, whether it's to validate something or to code gen APIs. So we are going to use it. So AI affects how we build and how fast we build and how capable we are at building. Of course, the other thing, that the other way is that any AI tool or product is now mostly APIs, right? Anthropic makes most of its revenue from the AI APIs. OpenAI, not most, but a huge amount. So everything is APIs behind it. And I think last but not least, and probably bigger, is what you described, which is, okay, now we have the potential for autonomous pieces of software to use our APIs in ways that we haven't thought about before. That's always been the case with APIs. APIs, as Mike Amundsen says, are pieces of code that you put out there and you touch people that you're never gonna meet in ways that you'd never imagined. So that's going to be more of that with agents. And I think my friend Zdenek Nemec also had something to say around that, where the APIs that we put out there, not all are usable or reusable by agents. We do have to change how we think and design those APIs. So those are the three ways I think that we touch APIs with AI.
That's the real thing that I want to explore. How do we change things and what needs to change to make them more discoverable, consumable, and safer integrations with these agents. Karl, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah. So, and John's familiar, maybe some of you others seen there. John and I did a blog series on digitalML, and he's familiar with some of the use cases that I'm interested in exploring with agents and APIs. And so basically, I want agents that can create some small process, like create a referral, create a prescription, right? But and then secondarily, I want those to be something that can be combined into orchestrations via natural language by another agent, right? So you've got something where a doctor in an encounter, in the context of this encounter, right, is going, hey, all right, I've seen the patient and I want to create this referral to see Dr. Joe. I need to send them for imaging and I need to get them a prescription for pain, right? So each one of those has these variables in them, right? And so your API has to have that clarity in description so that your agent can be trained and will know where to fill in these variables correctly every time, and so that your your agent knows the context to maintain to invoke each of those APIs. So I'm working with Fire APIs, and so you've got an encounter which has a patient and a doctor in it, and then a prescription will have that same patient and doctor in it, right? But what's ultimately going to change down somewhere is what are you prescribing? And then let's say it's an opioid, right? Well, now you may need to, or well, there could be other types of drugs where you need to look for drug interaction problems. You need to look for other opioid prescriptions because you don't want somebody overdosing, right? So you've got these kinds of things that need to be built into these agents, and the agents need to have an awful lot of understanding about the context that it's operating in and can't lose that. It's got to have understanding and be able to get from your API, and this is, I think, a critical thing, and I think I've talked to Emmanuel and John about in the past, about you need to know what to do next and how to get to it, right? It's that thing where it's, oh, hey, this is an opioid. You need to do a check, right? How do I do that, right? And that's going to vary potentially by the encounter. So it's those kinds of things that need to get built into APIs. I think Azaro is starting to build that out using the HADIOS capabilities, which not all APIs today use. Some of those things give you links. Here's what to do next, right? Got to give the agent that kind of prompt. So I think those are some of the areas APIs need to improve.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm hearing from other people in the community that are echoing what you're saying about hypermedia, arousal specifications, well-defined specs. What about in the cases of errors? Like maybe Emmanuel, do you have any thoughts on this? Like how do we not only just show status code, but give good next steps and help remediate problems that might arise?
So talking very practically here, we've seen LLMs and agents being able to recover from errors that they will naturally find in the execution of APIs. An agent or LLM will have a set of tools. It will try to exercise these tools, and most of the time there are going to be failures. And especially if the APIs are not designed for AI, which means they're simple and, just like Karl said, very atomic and built to the use case, very, very, very constrained. Most of the time, there will be failures. The reliability is going to be low. So now they have to be able to recover. What we've seen is if you have clear errors that say why there was an error and explain what to do next, then an agent can recover. And of course, the more information in the error and the more consistent the information in the error, of course, that's going to help the agent. So, for example, if you say, well, the agent tried to send in a post request and received the 400 error and it says 400 error, bad inputs. Okay,
Right.
well, what's the agent going to do? It's probably not going to be able to recover. But however, if you use maybe use problem details format, RFC 9457, if I'm correct, and there's information in there that says 400 error, bad input. The input was with a field. The field was, let's say, the age of the patient's field, and the age has to be between 18 and, I don't know, whatever, 120, versus you gave me a negative number, or whatever the case may be. Now the agent is going to see that. It's going to be able to recover, correct that data if it can, and resubmit. And now you've got a more reliable API, more chances of success, more chances for the agent to achieve what it's going to do.
I think we need to also talk about the elephant in the room, which is model context protocol, because that seems to be getting so much traction as a means to connect agents with APIs. Anyone want to talk about that? Maybe give a little intro and how that helps API design for agents.
Let me set the stage, and then I'll throw it to you, Jen. So I think we all agree that agents prefer structured APIs with rich metadata, and the theme of error codes well documented, and using that as a discovery or exploration method for AI agents becomes very interesting. And then how the agents consume those, whether it's on a gateway or a bunch of MCP servers or within an integration platform or A to A from Google. I think there's going to be a ton of different vendors and protocols and standards that are coming out on how to best make these APIs and data available to AI agents. And so I have a couple questions as we go into it. We've got these APIs with rich structured metadata. I'd argue that AI agents need it as much as developers do. They rely on predictable naming, clear contracts, strong documentation. So now, as an API provider, an enterprise, you want to have an updated portfolio available wherever you're going to deploy it. And then LLMs or AI agents are reading the APIs differently, so they need the context to map them to tasks. We touched on the Zaro and OpenAPI 3.1 and now MCP. And so two questions to the group. One is around the elephant in the room on MCP servers, and is that going to be the way we open this up? And then two, will AI agents and API consumers need two different versions of the same API, or are we just giving them different views of all that supporting rich documentation to help the consuming developers or AI agents navigate and find what they're looking for and make consumable actions?
Wow. So
I want to take the second.
Okay.
Someone go for the first.
Oh, I was going to jump on the second part too.
Oh, okay, you go for it.
So yeah, I it concerns me that well, maybe not concerned, but we've got this huge investment in existing APIs, and if all of a sudden we say, oh yeah, well, we're going to ignore that and come up with something completely different for agents, you start down this, investment path that is like, wow. And then somebody's going to get left behind, right? And so if the agents can take over all human development, I guess you're fine. But I think we're a ways away from that. So I'm kind of back to wanting to have API specs that are usable by both. That's kind of a personal preference. And um, yeah, so I think that's where my head's at with this, and I think John and I have talked about that in the past, but at least for the time being. But and then if I put on the Mr. Wizard hat and think in the future, it's like, well, why does an agent need structured JSON and all that nonsense? I mean, it doesn't care. That's to make it human readable, machine instruction, and that's what that was designed for. The machine doesn't need that. And at some point, it's like, well, do API specs, if you will, for agents become machine code?
I mean, we could change the media format entirely. Some of these
Exactly.
LLMs are actually performing better on like parsing images.
Yeah.
Like I think it was
Yeah.
who was I talking with? Someone at New Relic, I believe. They were talking about how they invented like an LLM to parse images to understand database schemas, and it was performing better than actually sending them a massive database. Crazy stuff. Yeah. But okay, I want to piggyback with what Karl was saying. I agree. I think they'll be more combined. Like we're not going to have separate agent and developer experiences that are totally in different camps, because I think like, yeah, a lot of pre-development has gone into great APIs and good developer portals, and the developer experience and the agent experience is not that totally dissimilar. Like there's a lot of compatibilities between the two. And there are things you can do under the covers to like expose APIs in a way for machines. Like, we're seeing that LLMs.txt file format become as a proposed standard. Maybe something like that, more metadata for APIs might become more standardized in the future. Also, thing about rate limiting. We haven't really talked about traffic controls at all. Like these autonomous agents, they're gonna do some crazy things. They could have like really bursty behaviors. So I feel like that's the one thing where you might need to do some stuff under the hood to like
I'd add,
differentiate traffic patterns.
rate limiting, and think about the onboarding process. If I'm a consuming developer internally, I have a different onboarding process than I do if I'm a partner or external API consumer looking at a portal and saying, do you have an API I can use? Does it meet my use case? Do I want to take on dependency? Do I have approval to use it? And we've built in the enterprise a very good onboarding authentication, ideally a connection to the provider workflow. So now you're influencing roadmap and you're aware of changes. That I think changes with an AI agent. You're not just going to build it and let them come. And so now you've got rate limiting, but you've got security, authentication, onboarding changes, that connection to the consumer, tracking reuse, tracking consumption. What's the onboarding process? And is that different for internal AI agent consumption or LLM access than it is for partners? What if we're embedding it into a product? We've got an API that's exposed in a SaaS platform. How does the onboarding process change?
And who are
That's
you
an excellent question.
authenticating?
I feel like it's not really ironed out yet.
Mhm.
Karl, Emmanuel, do you have any thoughts on
No,
how
no,
agents operate?
no doubt the onboarding has to be something that's automated and self-serve onboarding, right? The agent is not going to sit there and wait, for a week to get approval to use your API. It's just going to go away and fail or use something else, or go scrape your website or whatever the case may be. So there has to be some basically infrastructure things, like you mentioned the traffic and the rate limiting. Perhaps it's going to be the AI gateways. You mentioned the onboarding. Another thing is payments. An agent is, if there is a paid method to access the API, an agent has to be able to immediately transact and with its own budget pay for whatever services are there and be successful at paying and being authorized to use the API. So those are things that are going to either make or break API access. And if the agent fails, it's going to move on to your nearest competitor or nearest alternative. And now you've lost the business. It's. I think Karl, you were saying you're going to skip your turn. You said earlier, and it's going to go somewhere else. So these are things that you have to fix. But even then, let's say you fix all of this: the onboarding, the payments, the discovery, the rate limiting, and the traffic, the ability to handle traffic. Even then, that's the pipes that connect everything. Even then, it might turn out that the agent or the LLM is not able to use your API reliably. So you are going to have to do things. MCP is only a pipe, right? You just connect the APIs. You're going to have to do things about redesigning or rethinking your APIs and putting items on your roadmap for the long term to evolve your APIs so they're more reliably consumable by agents and LLMs. I think that's something that everybody's going to have to do.
Yeah, I think there's an investment in the existing APIs to, as we've talked about, like clarity, semantic consistency, etc., so that you're in identification of the gold standard API, because you don't want your agent, you don't want humans surfing through 500 APIs to find the best one. You don't want your agent wasting energy on that either. So you've got that, but then you want your gold APIs, the ones that you want your agents to be using, the NFRs that people are using today, around responses and so forth, or some of those are 5 seconds, ridiculously large numbers, right? And agents, man, they're going to be thinking milliseconds, microseconds. They're way faster, right? So I think some of that will need to get shifted a little bit. And then the other thing on the security space that I think is kind of an interesting one, which I think will require some changes too, is if you authenticate the agent. I mean, that's kind of one thing, but the agent's working for me, right? What if I'm not authenticated, but the agent that's working for my organization is. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing. So you kind of have this 2-layer authentication and traceability thing that needs to get solved for, and I'm not sure that's there yet.
I think the good news is we've been training for this. All the work that we've put into the self-service and automation and developer productivity and pipelines, and I agree with Emmanuel, the added pipes, we're adding another one with MCP. We've been training for this, and as you self-service and take the benefits of self-service in the enterprise, at least for developers and for pipelines and for support and for operations, providers, consumers, and then add a new consumer, the AI agent. I think probably internal AI agents and access to LLMs is easier to solve and probably a bigger benefit right away than let's just build an external API or agentic experience and hope we make money off of that. I think that's probably a little easier. But I think the good news is we've been training for this. And Emmanuel's point on treating it as a product and capturing consumption patterns and reuse and metrics and making decisions on roadmap is spot on, and it piggybacks on all the other things we've been training for and getting ready for in this space.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the companies that have the tooling in place, have great API best practices that are standard, are going to be far more well positioned for all this going into it. Cool. Let's kind of pivot to end business value and what all of this actually achieves at the end of the day. I want to make sure we're not, just designing new tech because it's fancy and cool. Like, we should have an end business value of creating intentional reusable APIs. So what do you guys think that is? And are there any tips on actually getting there? John, do you want to kick this one off?
I'll piggyback on what you just said and look at the winners and the winners that have built up the practice around API lifecycle management, that have a catalog of a holistic view of what they have, what's good, what's not, why. The ones that are ready to take advantage of new AI capabilities, whether it's updating documentation in a secure way or automating. I think you start seeing very quickly the flywheel effects. And so you mentioned the Bezos mandate in 2022 and helped Amazon scale their business. You look at what the retailers were doing 10 years ago in taking buy online, pick up in store, and how that piggybacked and flywheeled into digital platforms. We saw a big push in banking and digital banks and fintech competitors. The ones that invested in the space are in a great spot now. We're seeing a big push in healthcare. KP's a sneaky good fit in this space. And so I'll do it through 3 lenses. One is reuse and composability. We have a lot of good examples of customers adding big distribution or revenue partners that, think regional delivery partners in the time of COVID, that were able to take APIs and relaunch new offerings. So I think reuse and composability becomes a big business driver to why are we doing this. I'd also add consistency and control. You look at how easy it is to respond to a security threat when you have intentional APIs built, a view of what your portfolio is, who's providing, who's consuming, whether it's security or regulatory compliance or PII data, being able to have a view and respond. These things change as we add new functionality like agentic AI, and being able to make responses to that is a big business driver, I think. And then third is being able to understand and update. Karl, we've talked a lot about core system replacements and adding digital platforms. You had a good example of a business driver on being able to get business or miss out on business. A lot of these changes on the pipes and the infrastructure is going to change. And so being able to respond to multi-cloud or new gateways as that kind of functionality gets more and more available and cheaper costs. I think those 3 drivers of reuse and composability, consistency and control, and the ability to understand and update with flexibility are great business drivers and give technology leaders a big seat at the table.
And
Fantastic.
I think I'd echo a lot of what John's outlined there. The composability piece to me is pretty huge, actually. I think a lot of organizations struggle with changing their processes and organizational structures. And and a lot of that comes from like system limitations, right? You know, the underlying system is driving what you have to do. And instead, if you've got that resource exposed through an API, you can recombine the resources into new processes that align to your business structure that you want to achieve, to the processes you want. So I think there's a lot of that which you get as a benefit of having these really well-designed intentional APIs that, you know, if you're just going through some user interface that came from a vendor, yeah, it could be 6 months or a year before you see change, and you can't achieve what you want from your you're recomposing the organization, not just composing two APIs together, composing the organization, so I think the APIs lead to the organizational composability. And then I think, sort of put a different way, but along the lines of what John was talking about with to me, what is you probably got some digital strategy within your organization, right? And that could be new ways to access existing services, releasing wholly digital products that are wholly new, or just new channels for distribution. I think all of those are areas where APIs clearly, I mean, that's how you expose those capabilities is through APIs, right? And I think you really want to look at the API strategy around this as their strategic tools, and some of that could be, instead of if you create a web app, and so I can give access to you guys through my web app, but now you're over here working in your apps, and then you swivel chair over here and enter some stuff into my app and then type it back. You don't want that. And the counterpoint to that is, if I give you the API, you integrate my APIs into your applications, much smoother flow for you. But on top of that, I've just created some stickiness too, right? So, I really would love to have stickiness with my customers. So,
Exactly.
there's that kind of thing as well that I think is strategic value around the APIs.
Fantastic. Emmanuel, you also touched on direct monetization earlier. It seems like an obvious potential business value of positioning APIs for AI agents, especially if there's some sort of platform in the middle where users can give it tokens and they can, onboard and call these APIs. I'm curious about how that's going to look for the end user, and then what the, end business results are, and what kind of APIs can actually leverage something like that.
Yeah, I think the value can be there whether there's direct monetization or indirect monetization. So I think, for example, Salesforce.com attributes like $6 billion annually of value to APIs while not charging separately for the APIs. So the value can be there. And of course, part of that value for the providing organization is the stickiness that Karl mentioned. So you have to be able to do whatever you can to provide and illustrate the value of APIs. And I think, in a market-driven economy, especially with agents, the agents are going to show you the value. They're going to vote, if you will, with their feet, and kind of extract the value from you. And if you don't have proper APIs to extract the value, they'll go scrape your websites, and maybe you'll forego some of that direct value.
Cool. We've gotten a couple really good questions right here. Let's start with the one from Patrice. They're talking about something that I think is very common across a lot of companies, right? Not everyone is, an API native, right? So they're asking, how can we engage busy product managers and spark their interest in treating APIs as first-class citizens, especially in organizations where top-down support for beyond for moving beyond a traditional UI focused product is limited, and they don't have anything like an AWS API mandate, for example. Emmanuel, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, I think that we see that question quite a bit. But in this day and age, the first thing to think about is that APIs represent more than half of internet traffic. General traffic out there, anything between 60 and 80% of the traffic is due to APIs. So APIs are not some kind of backwater like they used to be. They're, most of what we do out there. So that's kind of an approach that we have to take. And I think as product managers, we have to be able to illustrate the value of APIs, whether the APIs power our UI products or whether they are a product in itself. And I think when people pose that question, I have a small tip to give that I've used in the past, and that is use your customers. Go to your customers and say, hey, how are APIs doing? Do you want more APIs or fewer APIs? What would you have to say? How would you influence our roadmap for APIs? And then take those direct quotes from your customers and bring them into your stakeholders. And most of the time, once you bring the direct quotes, stakeholders are going to be convinced. And if that doesn't work, ask your customers to directly speak to your internal stakeholders, and that will surely get their attention. So as a product manager, you have to be able to demonstrate and illustrate the value of the API products yourself. It's core part of your job.
That combination of customer validation, you're spot on, Emmanuel, with your technical stakeholders of how are you going to deliver it without an API, and does it meet what the customer or the market's asking for, is a great 1-2 combination.
The other thing, in terms of engaging your business around this, which is I think where you really want to shift the discussion, is really changing the language in discussing APIs. I mean, too much it's been that thing IT does to integrate stuff, and business people, they don't care about JSON and OAuth. Why should they, right? So I think the language needs to change to talk about connections, channels, enhanced partnerships, right? And kind of strip away some of the technology discussion away from this. Yes, that's the enabler, but let's have the discussion of what new partnerships do we want to create, right? And we have a technical solution for it, but we don't care about the details. And Patrice, I think I'll give you a little story about I was working with a guy who had been in insurance sales for decades, right? Not technical at all. And he was the biggest proponent I've ever had for APIs. He didn't understand anything about them, but he understood the connections that he needed to get. And he was getting the messaging from his, trading partners that was what they were looking for. He didn't care what it was, right? And so once you start with that, now you deliver successfully, now you've got an advocate for, this is the strategic direction that you want to go, not just, oh, hey, I need to build APIs and have big numbers of APIs. That you don't want that. You really want to have that discussion about what are the connections you want to create.
Yeah,
I had a company come and tell me that in B2B, the UI is mostly for demos. The API is where the real business happens. Kind of facetious, but yeah. Sorry.
So really ground things in the research, industry statistics, customer feedback, take a product management approach, and emphasize the strategic results. And that those use cases that we talked about earlier, that you can't really predict going into this. But there are great case studies out there, not to say that there aren't. Raj did mention something. They're wanting us to talk about omni-channel APIs. Could we touch on that a little bit and the design considerations going into designing something for omni-channel distribution? I mean, this can mean many different things, but I assume they're talking about delivering to different types of clients.
So, I
Karl?
think with omni-channel, and particularly in healthcare, you think about this, and I'm going to go a couple directions here, but one of the things that you look at with omni-channel in healthcare is that people are already multi-channel. They're on your healthcare app, they're on your website, and they may be doing call-ins, right? And they could be doing all of them simultaneously. So, and they could be doing, a lot of different touches across those different things, and they may or may not be related, right? So, one is, I think here is a huge opportunity for leveraging agentic AI, right? If you get some, especially where, and I've seen a demo of this actually, it was super awesome. But where if you're the call center and you get this call from somebody, and so John calls me and my agent comes up and says, oh, John just recently had an appointment, and he's also been on the website looking at the benefits page, and he's got this long running dispute with the company over a previous claim, right? So he's got a bunch of stuff going on with me, right? So, this is that area where you really need the APIs that allow, whether it's a human agent or an AI agent, you really need to have APIs that can into some data source or sources that will tell you this is stuff that's going on. And then the agent demo that I've seen that was really slick is, as the conversation was going along, and it was like, hey John, I see you've been just recently had an appointment, is this a follow-up? No, I'm interested in what this costs, right? Well, now I know this is related to benefits, and so the agent can now start doing the call outs to look at, oh, let's go and preload John's benefits so I can answer that question, right? So that's an agent that's helping a human agent, and it's doing the work on the backside. Super awesome stuff, right? And so I think that's the kind of area where, in order to enable that kind of omni-channel experience, you really have to have those APIs available across these multiple enterprise systems in order to get the answers back that you want. Otherwise, your omni-channel is sort of piecemeal and it falls apart. And so I think there's a lot of that design that needs to go in there. I'm not sure if that.
Emmanuel, I think of it as a product stack. Would you agree? You've got an API, say warehouse locator, that's available in the omnichannel mobile, web, in store as an agentic AI, and then you may be bundling more APIs into enabling that customer journey or member journey, like Karl's describing. So then you have APIs or API bundles being discoverable, readable, reliable, consumable. And then you have the API documentation that's discoverable and readable by the consumer, supporting whatever flow that is. Would you say the same?
I would say so, and I would say that the user journey is no longer linear.
Yes.
Anymore. And if I again put my product hats on, as a product manager, you have to go anticipate those use cases. There are more use cases, more eventualities out there than there used to be when we had simple UI and simple user journeys. So it's on you as a product manager now to imagine what's possible, and maybe use AI to help you imagine those as well.
Okay, good.
And when I think of omni-channel APIs, and you've got this, and kind of going back to one of our earlier touch points, around what needs to change in your API, coming back and just saying, oh yeah, John, he was, he had this appointment, he had this looking up benefits, and he had this complaint, right? Okay, that's great. But the next layer, if I'm thinking about an omni-channel API, an API supporting omni-channel, it should have the links in that response that says, and by the way, the next action says, go get the
Yeah, cool.
benefits, go get his complaint, go get, his appointment. That should be in that response. It should not just be, oh, hey, this is what's happened. And it's like, I'm guessing, and then I've got to do some more search, whether it's human or AI agent, it's got to do some more searching for what next. And, I think that's in designing the omni-channel API. It relates to our previous discussion of what needs to change in API for robustness. What next? What can I do next now that I've got this response?
Love that. Bringing it full circle with some practical advice on what to actually implement in the API design itself. Fantastic. Was there anything else we wanted to hit on? I feel like we covered an amazing amount of territory in just an hour here. We're over time, so I have to cut it. But
Yeah.
I feel like we could go on for another hour.
I think the only other thing, that we can maybe do very quickly is just talking about sprawl and how you move away from sprawl, and I just think one approach is if there's a set of standards, maybe you move to that, right? And that kind of just becomes a directive. The other thing I think is, if you've got something that's popular and good, maybe it's not standard, migrate to that. And then the migration itself, is really saying, hey, that's the reusable standard. That's the gold API that we want everyone to migrate to. And I don't know that, maybe one approach, of course, is you got lots of money and you can just say everybody migrate and pay that. The other is just say, yeah, eventually these other APIs, the consumers have some upgrade, and it's like, no, now you pay to migrate, and then you deprecate and retire those other APIs. So it becomes sort of a slow roll off. But I think the first step in all of it needs to be going through and identifying what is your gold API and making sure that's available, well identified in your catalog, and your catalog has that means of doing that.
For those
And just
here with
to emphasize,
yeah.
go.
I was just going to give a brief overview for people who might not be familiar with API sprawl. I see it as like the ungoverned creation and use of APIs, where you have so many that they might not be cataloged effectively, and you might have run into unawareness of where endpoints are and who's supporting them. And I just wanted to, just give a brief definition first. No problem. Emmanuel, any other thoughts on like sprawl?
Yeah, just to continue what you and Karl were saying, like invest in observability and analytics, product analytics for APIs, so that you know what's there, what's touching your APIs, what's getting used heavily, and what's not getting used barely, if at all. And that's going to help you, together with a decent API catalog, that's going to help you deal with the sprawl, zombie APIs, shadow APIs, whatever you want to call them. Because as Karl said earlier, the more of these you have out there, the larger the attack surface.
Absolutely.
I'm a solution provider for this, and we have a great independent catalog, and I think there's a very good playbook. And so I'd say, one, it's not trivial, but don't put your head in the sand, because it's not just AI and reusable APIs and gold standard APIs. There's all the security vectors that we started out with. The good news is there's a playbook. Get all your APIs into one catalog, keep it active and connected with the integrations. Like Karl said, figure out what's good, what's bad, what's why, who's using, who's consuming, how does this match up with our governance and standards and frameworks and architecture? And then, there's some great functionality, like use secure AI augmentation and your catalog and lifecycle reporting, so you can get your APIs documented and provide the context, and then put on your portfolio manager hat, put on your product owner hat, reach out to Karl and Emmanuel. They're great resources, and make decisions, review and polish the best ones, and then promote them. Retire the zombies, get rid of them. They haven't been called. They're weird anyways. Collapse and consolidate, and then track reuse, track changes. bake in the standards so that you get the flywheel effect. And then, you're getting the seat at the table. Take advantage of it. Become a solution provider in the company.
John, I think you forgot to mention to follow the Nordic API's blog.
Yeah. You were next on the list, so this was like, there's no chance I'm going to miss this. So, like, I think what a neat event today. You've got Karl with a perch at the enterprise, having a lot of experience with this. You've got Emmanuel with a perch in the product manager space and having a great course and outline. And then Bill, I love what you're building with Nordic APIs. I see you referenced in all of the resources that people have. I would definitely reach out to Bill and track Nordic APIs from a blog and webcast, because I love what you're building, and you've got a great following here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Not anticipating
Thank you.
that. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, agreed. I think we got a really good cast here today. Covered a lot of ground, really awesome insights. I feel like we're at an exciting inflection point in the API economy. So this is a really good, timely discussion to have right now. So yeah, let's just call it there. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, everyone. See you later.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.